Today in world literature, we turn to the work of the Indian writer Mahasweta Devi. Our lecturer is Dr. David Rothenberg. Devi is Bengal's leading novelist. Born into a well-known artistic family in 1926, her father was a writer and social worker, one uncle a filmmaker, another a social scientist. Involved with the political life of her country, she has over 100 books to her credit. She took as a theme in her novels women's subjugation as linked to oppressions of caste and class. Her theme is especially important to the imaginative life that occurred in Indian women writing in the 20th century. Women, Susie Thakru and K. Latika argue in Women Writing in India, were influenced by three historical events in their nation. The first influence was the nationalistic Swadeshi movement in 1905 through 1908, a cultural formulation that claimed that Indians should enfranchise former colonial locations as, quote, of one's own country. The second was the liberalism of national women's organizations, and the third was the socialist commitments of the Progressive Writers Association. These movements of cultural politics gave shape a unique voice of women writing in India. Mahasweta Devi's short story, Breast Giver, is a striking example of a complex story that is interwoven in Hindu culture, even as it critiques class ideologies that exploit women.
Okay, this story, Breast Giver, is by Mahasweta Devi. She writes in Bengali, the language of millions of people in the eastern part of India and Bangladesh, one of numerous languages in India. This, is a really tough story. It's one of the longest and most difficult stories in this book. I think one of the reasons it's difficult is it presents at the same time a kind of outline and description of this strange and different and crazy culture, the whole continent of India. And the others, at the same time, it is portraying a critique of this culture and looking at a woman's life in this culture and how it's twisted around. That combined with the kind of upside-down, topsy-turvy, strange details of how the Indian caste system blurs together with kind of imbalances in economic status makes it just a very complicated and engaging and perplexing story. But it's hard. There's a lot of different categories. There's a style which is very ironic. It's making fun of this crazy world and describing it at the same time, which is one of the marks of literature from India. Although this story was written in Bengali, a lot of Indian writers find their first language is English, a special kind of English that sort of comes out of the British Empire mixed with the craziness that is India. Salman Rushdie is known for this, R.K. Narayan and such, this sort of craziness. And this story, this is a PC story. This is a politically correct story. It's about women's issues, a woman's struggle in a society that is both really hard on women, at the same time gives women a lot of power in an unusual way. It's very different than our society. What's so different about it? Jashoda is the main character in this story. She's called the breast giver. She's a wet nurse. She has 20 kids of her own and nurses 30 other babies. What a crazy life. How did this happen? Here's how she describes it in the beginning, or how it's described by the author. Jashoda doesn't remember if her aunt was kind or unkind. It's as if she were Kangalachiran's wife from birth, the mother of 20 children, living or dead, counted on her fingers. Jashoda doesn't remember at all when there was no child in her womb, when she didn't feel faint in the morning, when Kangali's body didn't drill her body like a geologist in the darkness lit by an oil lamp. She never had the time to calculate if she could or could not bear motherhood. Motherhood was always her way of living and keeping alive her world of countless beings. Jashoda was a mother by profession, a professional mother. Jashoda was not an amateur mama like the daughters or wives of the master's house. The world belongs to the professional. In this city, this kingdom, the amateur beggar, pickpocket, hooker has no place. Even the mongrel on the path or sidewalk, the greedy crow at the garbage don't make room for the upstart amateur. Jashoda had taken motherhood as her profession. So this is a kind of charged paragraph right here. Motherhood as profession makes a certain amount of sense, but it really is a critique of the tradition at the same time. Now, Jashoda is married to Kangali or Kangalicharan, and they are Brahmins. They're from the highest caste in Indian society, but they're very poor. They work, their employers, the Haldar family, are from a lower caste, but they have more money. How can this be? It's part of the strange caste system in India, these injustices, these unusual things. What sets the whole story in motion is one of the sons in the Haldar family runs over Kangali's legs. He's playing around in a motor car. He's a kind of irreverent character, and he makes him lame for life. He's the husband. He cannot work as well. He's limited in what he can do. And his wife, Jashoda, then decides to become a wet nurse. She's going to take care of all these kids and nurse them. And why is she going to do this? Well, she has big breasts, and she's considered valuable in this way. But the husbands of the wealthier people, they're worried about their wives nursing the babies and having their breasts start sagging and not look so good. And so they kind of want to upset the tradition, and the whole story calls into question what does it mean to be a good and complete and successful woman in India? And is this a comical extreme story, this woman nursing all these kids, craziness, or is it sad? Is it depressing? It's a mix of all these things, and it's both realistic but mixed into all kinds of references to the many gods and goddesses of the Hindu way of life. And the story in action moves from the 1950s up to the present day. And in the actions of the story and the way of life of people, it really moves from the 16th century to the present. This compound where the Haldar family lives and the people who work there, it's described as you enter the 16th century as you enter the gates of this house. To this day, you take your wife by the astrological almanac. Okay. So, what happens is that Jashoda and Kangali get to live in this compound, and Jashoda is extremely valuable because she's very good as a wet nurse. Kangali has a job outside, but it's not as important. Then the patriarch of the Haldars, Haldar Babu means like grandpa, he dies. Then what happens? What happens to them? Are they still kept around? Well, luckily enough, lots of other cousins and many relatives. Everyone is having tremendous numbers of kids. These Indian women seem the ideal is to be pregnant every year, as many kids as possible. And that's really the way it's been in many parts of India and many parts of the world. So this story examines that. And Jashoda is tremendously respected for her ability to always have enough milk to nurse all these little kids. Here's how she's described. Section 2, page 270. Jashoda is fully an Indian woman whose unreasonable, unreasoning, and unintelligent devotion to her husband and love for her children, whose unnatural renunciation and forgiveness have been kept alive in the popular consciousness by all Indian women from Sati Savitri Sita through Nirupa Roy and Chand Osmani. Who are all these people? Well, the first ones are goddesses, the others are popular stars who I don't really know who they are, but there they are. The creeps of the world understand by seeing such women that the old Indian tradition is still flowing free. They understand that it was with such women in mind that the following aphorisms have been composed. A female's life hangs on like a turtle's. Her heart breaks, but no word is uttered. The woman will burn, her ashes will fly. Only then will we sing her praise on high. And there you're talking about the famous vision of women in India that if their husbands die, they're supposed to be burned too. This actually goes on to the present day, although not in this story, but it's in the background. Jashoda never once wants to blame her husband for her present misfortune. He was maimed, he's lame, and she's stuck doing this. Is it his fault? Well, not really. She wants to become the earth and feed her crippled husband and helpless children with a fulsome harvest. It's admirable as she's sort of sacrificing herself to this. It's both the traditional right way in this culture and not. How does the next generation of the Haldar family treat their employees? Well, Kangali and Jashoda are Brahmins, but, big deal. They're not so... this generation is not so excited about the old caste system and the importance. Remember that Haldar Babu was nice to Jashoda and Kangali because they were Brahmins. They were poor, but from a higher caste, so he went out of their way to make their life better. But the next generation is saying that the mistress of the next generation is saying, "Let me see, dear, let me think and see." This mistress, it says here on page 272, is not as sold on Brahmins as the master was. She does not accept fully that Kangali lost his feet because of her son's afternoon whims. It was written for Kangali as well. Otherwise, why was he walking down the road in the blazing sun, grinning from ear to ear? You know, fatalism. So he was meant to have his feet cut off. We don't care so much. But she looks in charmed envy at Jashoda's mammal projections. That's supposed to be breasts. And says, the good Lord sent you down as the legendary cow of fulfillment. Pull the teat and milk flows. The ones I've brought to my house haven't a quarter of this milk in their nipples. She's jealous of these breasts, and cows are important in India, taken seriously, but nevertheless she's comparing this woman to a cow. It's not very nice. That's not, it's not very respectful, generally, treating her well. Okay. But meanwhile, to have all this milk in her breast, Jashoda has to keep getting pregnant herself. She's having all her own kids. But it's not even an issue. You know, nobody seems to these kids aren't even in the story. It's just the fact that she's being this wet nurse that is most significant. And the action moves forward. And page 275, it moves up to the present. Kangali's shins were cut in the 50s, and our narrative has reached the present. In 25 years, in 30, Jashoda has been confined 20 times. The maternities toward the end were profitless, for a new wind entered the Haldar house somehow. Let's finish the business of the 25 or 30 years. You know, this is a very chatty story. You can see the way it's written. You can imagine that it should be spoken kind of fast, and you know, people in Bengal speak English very, very quickly. If you meet any, you'll know. The maternities toward the end were profitless, for a new wind entered the Haldar house somehow. Let's finish the business of the 25 or 30 years, kind of like that. At the beginning of the narrative, Jashoda was the mother of 3 sons. Then she became gravid 17 times. Mrs. Haldar died. She dearly wished that one of her daughters-in-law should have the same good fortune as her mother-in-law. In the family, the custom was to have a second wedding if a couple could produce 20 children. Deserve a second wedding. But the daughters-in-law called a halt at 12, 13, 14. This is the modern age. Only 14 kids. By evil counsel, they were able to explain to their husbands and make arrangements at the hospital. All this was the bad result of the new wind. Progress, changing issues. You know, you talk about overpopulation as a problem that people often think up here in our part of the world that this is an issue of the third world developing countries, that there's the huge population growth and we kind of grow a little bit. Somewhat true. But, you know, it's generally said that when women get educated around the world, wherever they are, educate women, they're not going to want to have so many kids. These traditions often have to do with men and their just desires to have as many kids as possible, preferably sons. And as more women are educated, there's a change in this practice. Only 14 kids. Bad result of the new wind. Wise men have never allowed a new wind to enter the house. That's what we have to say about progress. So what happens, you know? You can't be a wet nurse forever. And women are not that, if this is her role in life, she doesn't have to be that old before it stops working out. And what happens? Here on page 277, Jashoda went to throw herself at the goddess's feet. Her aging, milkless, capacious breasts are breaking in pain. Let the lion seated understand her pain and tell her the way. Lion seated is the goddess who keeps going back to, in whose temple her husband works. The only place he can work, being lame. So, what happens to her? More and more misfortune. Now is the downward time for Jashoda, on page 279. The milk-filled, faithful wife who was the object of the reverence of the local houses devoted to the Holy Mother. It is human nature to feel an inappropriate vanity as one rises, yet not to feel the surrender of, let me learn to bite the dust since I'm down, as one falls. As a result, one makes demands for worthless things in the old way, gets kicked by the weak. The same thing happened to Jashoda. No one cares about her anymore. She gets cancer. She gets breast cancer. In the time period where it's just becoming recognized that this is a dangerous disease in India, something the last generation, when she began the story, no one would really know how to deal with. And here she is in the hospital, sort of hopeless for her, too late to do anything. And the doctors are amazed. They know that she's fed some 50 children, 20 of her own, 30 other kids. She's fed from her breasts, and now these breasts are useless. One of them just explodes like a volcano, just falling apart. And that's the end for her. And here's the way she's described at the end in glowing terms by the writer. Jashoda Devi, Hindu female, lay in the hospital morgue in the usual way, went to the burning ghat in a van and was burnt. She was cremated by an untouchable. Everyone's cremated by an untouchable because they're the only ones allowed to do that. She started as a Brahmin, high up in caste, not much money or status, but respected in a way. In the end, everyone was burned away into dust. Jashoda was God manifest. Others do and did whatever she thought. Jashoda's death was also the death of God. When a mortal masquerades as God here below, she is forsaken by all, and she must always die alone. It's a sad and busy story going over 40, 50 years of time. And it's very moving and crazy at the same time. And it does not, it's both realistic and I think, forced as well. It's really pushing. I mean, this is just, it has this magically realistic quality of, 20 kids, 30 kids. It's just, is it extreme? Is it realistic? Does it happen? I'm not sure. Do we respect this character, Jashoda, for going through all this? I think certainly. What do we think about the society that makes this possible? It's crazy, but it's not, you don't get a sense that there's a lack of human warmth among the people. They're not quite sure how to deal with each other, how to deal with their differences, how to deal with changing values. When the more sophisticated women don't want to nurse their babies anymore because it will ruin the way they look. And they're still supposed to get pregnant all the time. The tension is here. You get the sense that here's a character from this generation. It's not going to happen the same way in the future. India is changing. This is a story that comes from a changing India to us. We look at it from this distant world and it seems kind of unrealistic, but at the same time, this stuff is going on and the world is a changing place. As a work of literature, I think it's sort of fascinating and rich with details and irony and this chattiness. I really think the way to imagine it is imagine somebody telling you the story, talking incredibly fast, very, very quickly, and slow down to catch it all, but then get a sense of the real energy to it. And, I think the main question at the end is where do we stand in relation to this character? Is she a heroine? Is she a victim? Is she to be applauded or kind of deeply respected? Or, was her death also the death of God? I mean, when anyone dies, there's some divine spark that probably disappears at the same time. You want to be able to advise her earlier in life and say, you don't have to live this way. You don't have to suffer so much. But the same way, her society gave her tremendous respect because of living in this way. And so, the issues are open. There's a lot to talk about in this story. And there's a lot of mixture of fiction and fact in it. And I hope you enjoy it and get some sense out of it. Thanks.
Clearly, feminist criticism yields a great deal about this story. We see here patriarchal institutions of the damage they do to the individual. As fiction, Breastgiver allows us to see that Jashoda as a figure representing all Hindu women who cooperate with established social and religious practices, and ironically lose their value. To broaden our view of women Indian writers, we might also look briefly at Amrita Pritam's poem entitled Amrita Pritam. It goes like this. There was a pain. I inhaled it silently like a cigarette. There are a few songs I've flicked off like ashes from the cigarette. The title itself upsets the traditional view of Indian women as supplicant. The poet gives her name to the poem, thus empowering the text with biographical vitality. The cigarette, suggesting worldliness, is also a simile for pain. Without suffering, the poet appears to suggest consciousness will not be born. In both Pritam's poem and Devi's story, the writers practice awareness and advocate self-discovery. They have turned inward in their search for identity, a characteristic element of women's literature suggested by Elaine Showalter. As students of literature, we'd be prepared to deconstruct gender stereotypes and examine received notions about women's cultural roles.